This recording is for the second part of Module 13 for biology. And I'm going to start with reproduction in just the general information in covering reproduction for phylum Chordata. And I realize this is included in the previous video, but because we didn't get to it in class last week, I want to go ahead and include it on this video. So reproduction, the male reproductive organ is the testes, and that reproductive organ produces sperm. And the main female reproductive organ is the ovary, which produces eggs. And there are two types of fertilization that can take place. And those two types of fertilization are internal fertilization and external fertilization. For internal fertilization, the male places the sperm in the female body. And fertilization takes place inside the female. And in general, we would say that land animals that live on land, have internal fertilization. Okay, then external fertilization is where the female lays eggs. And the male fertilizes them outside of the body. Okay, and as we will see, generally, we would say that aquatic or water animals have external fertilization. And we'll see that especially today when we start looking at some of those aquatic animals. Okay, so fertilization is either internal or external. Then we need to look at development. How does development of the offspring occur? And with regard to development in those animals that are part of phylum Chordata, we have three types of development. The first one is called oviparous. And in oviparous, the types of animals that have oviparous development are birds. So in here the offspring develop in an egg outside of the female's body. So if you think about chickens, an egg is fertilized, and then that egg is laid, and after 21 days, the offspring will hatch from that egg outside of the female body. Okay, so that's oviparous. The second type is called ovoviviparous. And in this type of development, development occurs in an egg inside the female's body. Now this is a more rare type of development. So in other words, the egg stays inside the mother until they hatch, and then the live young come out of the mother after they have hatched. So there's a type of tropical fish that is called a guppy, and guppies are an example of ovoviviparous development. Then the last type of development is called viviparous. And with viviparous, the offspring develop inside the female, and the offspring receive nutrients from the mother through a placenta. So this is the type of development that occurs in mammals. So in the other two types of development, where did the nutrients come from? Well, the nutrients come from the egg itself. The nutrients contain, or the egg contains the nutrients. But in this case, the offspring get the nutrients from the mother through the placenta connected to the connection between the mother and the baby is through the umbilical cord. Okay, so that finishes up the general characteristics of members of phylum Chordata. What we're going to do now is go through some different classes and kind of hit the high points of information and talk about a few organisms that are a member of that class. So the first one we want to do is called class Agnatha. And class Agnatha are what are commonly referred to as jawless fish. So they don't have a jaw, and what they do is they have their mouth is filled with teeth and with a tongue, and they actually they feed as parasites on on other organisms. So they will attach themselves to their prey with this kind of suction-like mouth, and they suck the blood, and then they'll just move on. They'll move on to another creature once they are no longer getting enough blood from the host. They will move on to another host. So let me show you a picture of this is a lamprey. So the lamprey is a common member of the class Agnatha. And I want you to see so they have these rows of teeth that act kind of like a sucker-like mouth that they use to attach to their prey, and then using suction. They actually have their tongue, they scrape their tongue along the skin of the prey, and then they suction on. And this last picture, you can see the lamprey here attached to the fish, and they will suck the blood of the fish until there is no more, and then they will move on. A lamprey, their skeleton is made of cartilage, so it's not, cartilage is bone that has not been calcified. It doesn't have calcium as a component of it, so it's very flexible, strong, but not as strong as bone, and very flexible. The other thing about class Agnatha is that they are what we call anadromous. Anadromous, and what this term means is that they are hatched in fresh water. They live their adult lives in salt water. So in the ocean, salt. Then they return to fresh water to reproduce. So perhaps you've also, so the lamprey is an example of an anadromous organism. Salmon is another example. You've probably heard that salmon will, they leave the ocean and they go to freshwater streams in which they lay their eggs. The young are hatched there, and then those young migrate out to the ocean. They live their adult lives in the ocean. They return to the fresh water to reproduce, lay their eggs. The whole cycle starts over again. So anadromous is a characteristic of class Agnatha. Okay, so that's all we're going to say about class Agnatha. The next class that we are going to talk about is class Chondrichthyes. So Chondrichthyes. And that word, chondrichthyes, this means cartilage, and the word ichthys means fish. Okay, so these are fish whose skeleton is made of cartilage, so they're sometimes referred to as the cartilaginous fish. So their skeleton is not, just like the lamprey, the skeleton is not reinforced with calcium. And so the skeleton is more flexible and not as hard as a skeleton that has been reinforced with calcium. So the members of this class that you would be most familiar with would be sharks, and rays. So like stingrays are an example of an organism that is part of class Chondrichthyes. Let's go ahead and look at a shark, some pictures of a shark. Okay, so this is the external features of a shark. I'm going to point out a couple things here. So the shark has various fins that help it to move through the water. The dorsal fin is the one that you're probably most familiar with, because that's the one that typically in movies you see sticking up above the water. But they do have other fins that are used for various balance and to help it move through the water. The shark breathes through gills, and so basically as the shark is moving through the water, the water will pass over the gills, and the gills are underneath these gill slits, but the water passes over the gills, and when that happens, the shark will remove oxygen from the water. So that's how they get their oxygen, and they will place carbon dioxide into the water. So remember, CO2 is waste. Sharks they swim with their mouths open. So if you're ever in an aquarium, you can watch that to see, but they swim with their mouths open, so that that helps to facilitate the movement of the water over the gills. So the water goes in their mouth, and then it moves over the gills, and then they take the oxygen out and put this carbon dioxide in. If we were to look at the brain of a shark, we would see that its optic lobe, so remember, optic lobe is for sight. Their optic lobes are not very big. So they have these eyes here, this eye that we see is connected to the optic lobe, but they do not have a very good sense of sight. So the optic lobe is not very large. However, there's another structure that we see here that is called the nares. And the nares is basically like our nostril. and it is connected to the olfactory lobe. And remember, that is the lobe that is responsible for smell, and the olfactory lobes of a shark would be larger because they do have a very keen sense of smell. The other structure that I will point out on this figure is this thing here called the lateral line. So lateral line. And the lateral line is, its job is to detect vibration. So as the shark is moving through the water, the lateral line detects vibration, and then that those vibrations get communicated to the shark's brain, and it's really used to help them locate prey, to locate other obstacles in the water. So the lateral line is a very important sense organism for the shark. Let's look at, I want to show you a picture of the shark teeth. So even though we said that a shark's skeleton is not calcified, their teeth usually are. And so their teeth, they have, you probably already know this, but they have multiple rows of teeth, and they lose those teeth about every they'll lose teeth about every 1 to 2 weeks. And they have multiple rows of teeth, so that when one tooth falls out, then the one from a back row moves forward and takes its place. And as I said, the teeth of a shark are calcified, so that means they are stronger and they are able to grasp and tear at food. So different types of shark have different, their teeth are shaped in different ways. For a shark, in terms of their reproduction, so the males have a structure on the back that is called a clasper, and that organ is used to place the sperm into the female. So they actually have internal fertilization. And then they are oviparous, so they eggs are laid, and they will those eggs will attach usually to some surface, like a hard surface, and they are hatched in the water. So they internal fertilization and oviparous. So this they would be an exception to what we said, that most aquatic animals have external fertilization. The sharks actually have internal fertilization. Okay, I think that is all we will say about class Chondrichthyes. Okay, and then the next one that we are going to do is class Osteichthyes. So if you remember from before, we said that when you see this osti, that means bone. And here's that word that means fish. So members of this class are sometimes referred to as the bony fish. So they have a true skeleton that is made of calcified bone, unlike the shark that was made of cartilage. There are a couple of things I want to point out. Let's go ahead and look at the external anatomy of a fish. So just like the shark, they have various fins that are used for swimming, used for maintaining balance and direction. One thing that I want to point out with the fish is that if you look at their tail, their tails are flat. The fin tail, the caudal fin, which is the tail fin, is flat side to side. And so when they swim, that fin moves side to side, and so the fish moves side to side as they swim. If we were to look at the tail of a porpoise or a dolphin, their tails are flat top to bottom. And so if you were to look at that, the way they swim, as they swim, they're moving up and down in the water, not side to side. Okay, so that's the tail. If we look at the tail of these organisms, we can often tell how they would be moving in the water. I want you to notice that this fish also has a lateral line, and that lateral line is used to sense vibrations in the water, and they can use that then to find prey or to avoid predators. Another structure in terms of the external anatomy. So what have we mentioned? Let's go ahead and write up here what we've mentioned so far. So we said that their tail fin or caudal fin is flat side to side, and then we said that they have a lateral line that is used to feel vibrations, and then the lateral line then feeds information to their brain, and they can use that to locate prey or to avoid predators. Okay, then another structure that I would like to mention is something that is called the operculum. I'm going to go ahead and erase this. So the operculum is a structure that covers the gills. So it provides protection over the gills. And when we do our dissection of a fish, you'll be able to see that operculum. So if we go back to our picture here, so here is the operculum right here. And if we were to pull that operculum back, we would see the gills underneath. So again, as the fish swims, the water moves in through the mouth, and then it flows over the gills, and then as it flows over the gills, they remove oxygen from the water, and they place CO2 in the water. So they get rid of their waste by putting it into the water. And they remove the oxygen from the water. And the fish are really efficient at doing this. So as the water flows over the gills, they're able to take out about 80% of the oxygen that is in the water. They are able to remove from the water. So that's very efficient way of doing it. So basically what happens is when the fish opens their mouth, the water goes in, and then they close their mouth. And when they close their mouth, then the operculum opens up, and then the water passes over the gills, and then they pick up oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide, and then the water leaves again through the operculum. So in through the mouth, then they close the mouth, open the operculum, the water flows over the gills. Once the water has flown over the gills, then they close the operculum. One of the things that we'll do when we do our dissection is, so obviously their food also comes in through the mouth. So one of the things we'll do is we'll take a probe and we'll stick a probe into their mouth. And when we do that, there's actually two ways that things can go once they get in the mouth. They can either go through the gills. So we'll put a probe in and we'll see that it can come out through the gills. But if we go straight back, it'll go into the digestive system or into the stomach or intestines. These fish, their bodies are covered with scales, and we'll look at those scales when we do our dissection. And different types of fish have different scales. And those really are for protection of the organism. However, the scales, underneath the scales, they actually secrete a mucus. And that mucus does several things. One is that it provides some waterproofing. It also can it helps them move in the water. So it kind of reduces drag. And then the other thing that the mucus does is that there are sometimes parasites that will try to live on a fish, and the mucus, that layer of mucus, can help to protect them from parasites. So that mucus is secreted. There are glands near the scales or near the skin that secrete this mucus. And when you pick up a fish and you think that it feels slimy, it's that mucus that is giving the fish its slimy feeling. Okay, let's look then. I think that's it for the external anatomy. Let's look now at the internal anatomy of the fish. Picture here, and I'm going to point out a few things here. So a fish has a complete digestive system. And we've seen this in other animals. So the digestive system starts at the mouth, and waste is eliminated through the anus. Let's go back to that picture, and I want to point out a few things about their digestive system. So the water goes in the mouth, and then once it goes in the mouth, so here's the gills, these are the gills here, but the water would go in the mouth, and then the esophagus kind of runs behind the gills, but we're showing the esophagus here. And then it would go into the stomach. So we see the stomach here. And then it would go into the intestine, which we see here. And then it would get eliminated through the anus. Okay, so that's the complete digestive system. So it goes esophagus, stomach, intestine, and then out the anus. I do want to point out that there are several other organs that the fish has that help with digestion. And the first one that I want to point out is this organ right here. Let me erase all this other stuff. So this thing right here, this kind of finger-like looking thing, is called the pyloric ceca. And what it does is that it secretes enzymes that help in the digestion of the food. So you can see that pyloric ceca is near both the stomach and the intestine. And so here's the stomach and here's the intestine. So it secretes enzymes both into the stomach and the intestine to aid in the digestion or help to break down food. And then the other structure that I want to mention here is the liver. So you see that right there. And the liver in a fish is important because it secretes a substance called bile. And what bile does is that it helps to break down fat. And the liver also cleans the blood. This is one of the functions of your own liver. Both of these are true in mammals too. So if there is bacteria in the blood, the liver will kill it or will clean it out. Dead blood cells are removed by the liver. So many of your blood cells only live for a few months and then they die, and the liver will clean those out. And then it will remove toxins. So some of the foods that organisms eat have byproducts that are actually toxic, and the liver will help to remove those toxins. So the liver is a very important organ in fish as well as other organisms. Okay, another structure that I want that you should know in the fish is something called a swim bladder. And when we do our dissections, we should be able to see this. So the swim bladder, the eraser. Okay, so the swim bladder or air bladder is this yellow thing right here, and the air bladder is used to help keep the fish afloat. So the swim bladder helps them to float. And what they do is they take gases that are formed in the digestive system, so gases that are formed in the stomach or intestines, can fill the swim bladder, and then so it's basically like an inner tube to help them stay afloat. And then if they want to rise, if the fish needs to rise to the surface of the water, then the air bladder or swim bladder will be filled with these gases. And when they want to sink toward the bottom, they would release those gases from the air bladder. One thing I forgot to mention about the shark when we did the shark is that sharks don't have swim bladders. And one of my classes just dissected sharks, and when you feel their liver is really cool to feel because it is the liver secretes an oily substance that because oil is less dense than water, helps the sharks to stay afloat. So when you feel a shark's liver, it feels very, very oily. And that's the mechanism that they use to stay afloat because they don't have a swim bladder. Fish, in terms of their brain, they have a large optic lobe, and they have a large olfactory lobe. So they have both a good sense of smell and a good sense of sight. Let's see, I don't know, we don't see the brain on this picture. Oh yeah, we do actually. So we don't see the parts of the brain, but here's the spinal cord that leaves the brain. And then here is the brain itself right there. But you would see that they have both a large olfactory lobe and a large optic lobe. In terms of reproduction, members of Osteichthyes, their reproduction, so they are, they have external fertilization. So the male lays eggs in the water. I'm sorry, wrong. That was wrong. Females lay eggs. And then the males cover those eggs with sperm. And then you hope that fertilization will take place. And then the eggs are just left to develop and hatch. So this, we would say they are oviparous. If we look at the circulatory system, the one thing I would point out about the circulatory system that's different from other organisms is that they have a two-chambered heart. So one of the things that we'll see is, so in the organisms that we've looked at so far, they just had a heart. It wasn't divided into chambers. But as organisms get more complex, the heart also gets more complex. And so in a fish, they have an upper chamber that is called the atria, and the lower chamber is called the ventricle. And so the atria is the chamber that receives the blood as it is returned from the body, and the ventricle is the heart. That's the part of the heart that pumps the blood out. So once the blood has flown, once the blood has picked up oxygen, then it gets returned to the atria, then it flows into the ventricle, and the ventricle is what pumps the blood out of the heart, so that it then gets transported through arteries throughout the body. Okay, so that's what I want you to know about the circulatory system. Another last thing that you should know about this class is that they are ectothermic. And ectothermic is a term that we often just use the word cold-blooded. And what that means is that they do not have an internal mechanism to regulate their body heat. So in other words, their body temperature will vary with the outside environment because they don't have a way of regulating that internally like we do. We are not cold-blooded. We have a part of our brain that's called the hypothalamus that helps to regulate our body temperature. Okay, last thing that we will do in this module then is class Amphibia. And class Amphibia, most of them begin their lives, they have two life cycles. So most of them begin their lives in water. And they begin in a larval stage, and they have gills. But then they have the adult phase when the gills degenerate, and they develop lungs and other ways to breathe. We'll see what those other ways are in just a moment. Okay, so they start out in a larval phase. You probably are familiar with tadpoles. That's the larval phase. In that phase, they're breathing through gills. They're in the water. And then they go through their metamorphosis. The gills degenerate. They develop lungs and other ways to breathe. And then they are able to spend at least some of their time on land. Okay, so that is class Amphibia. We'll go ahead and talk about their reproduction. So the females lay eggs in the water. Then the males fertilize them. And the fertilized eggs develop in the water. So they have external fertilization, and they are oviparous. Let's go ahead and look at their circulatory system and their respiratory system. Well, first of all, let's start with the circulatory system. So they have a 3-chambered heart. And what they have is they have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. So if we look at their heart, they have 2 upper chambers and 1 ventricle. The left atrium, and we always name the size of the heart based on the animal, not based on the way us looking at it. So this would be the left atrium. And this would be the right atrium. And what the left atrium does is the left atrium has oxygen-rich blood. So the left atrium has received oxygen-rich blood from the lungs, from the skin, from the mouth. We'll talk about those in just a moment. So this is blood that has a lot of oxygen in it. The right atrium is filled with oxygen poor blood because that blood is blood that has just returned from the body, so from other parts of the body. So this is oxygen poor. And interestingly enough, when that blood empties into the ventricle, they mix. So the blood, and then the ventricle pumps the blood out throughout the body. So it's a unique thing because usually the blood that gets pumped out is very oxygen rich. Here you actually get a mixture of oxygen rich and oxygen poor blood that gets pumped out, so it's not as oxygen rich as it could be. But it's a 3-chambered heart. And as I said, remember, as the organisms get more developed, we'll see that the heart becomes more complicated. Okay, so that's the circulatory system. If we look at the respiratory system, so we said that they have lungs. So in their adult stage, they have lungs. However, that is not their primary way of breathing. The primary way that they breathe is their skin. So this is the primary respiratory organ. So when we dissect a frog, you will see that on the other side of the skin, there are a lot of blood vessels. And so the frog is able to, oxygen and carbon dioxide can just move right across the skin, and they can breathe in that way. And we'll see that there's a lot of small blood vessels that are called capillaries. The other way that they can breathe is through the mouth. And again, inside the mouth, there are a lot of blood vessels. And so the oxygen and the carbon dioxide can also just move across the mouth into the blood. So they have 3 ways of breathing, but the skin is their primary respiratory organ. So because they can breathe through their skin, they can actually stay underwater for long periods of time, because animals that just breathe through their lungs have to surface to be able to take in air into the lungs, but because they're able to breathe through their skin and through their mouth, they can stay under for longer periods of time. Let's see. The only other thing I will say about class Amphibia is that they are ectothermic. So just like the fish, they don't have an internal mechanism to control their body temperature. And in fact, many members of class Amphibia will, in colder temperatures, they will burrow into the mud as a way of trying to maintain or retain some of their body heat. Okay, so that is all we are going to say about class Amphibia. And that is going to finish the material for Module 13. And the last module we had to complete is Module 16.